Hello everyone, today I want to take a look at a very extraordinary claim made in 20th century philosophy. It was proposed by the Jamaican singer and songwriter Carl Douglas back in 1974, and it basically claims that in space and time there was a point wherein everybody was kung fu fighting. Now what brought my attention to this extraordinary claim was a image macro that I found back in 2020 containing a fragment of the works of American philosopher and thinker Ben Shapiro, who said that, we read, "Oh, everybody was kung fu fighting. I find it very hard to believe that 7 billion people know the martial art and performed it simultaneously while executing expert level kicks at rapid velocity. Literally impossible." Now, I do disagree with Mr. Shapiro about the extent of the impossibility of that happening, but I still can appreciate the fact that this made me realize just how improbable that claim seems to be. Now let's take a look at this claim. We will call it the Kung Fu thesis, and it was proposed in 1974 by the aforementioned Carl Douglas. It says, everybody was kung fu fighting. Those kicks were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening, but they fought with expert timing. Now, what we have is 4 premises, but we will it all basically rests on the first premise that everybody was kung fu fighting, and that is what we will try to understand today. Because historically there's been a lot of responses to this kung fu thesis. There's been a type of rejectionism movement started by Ben Shapiro, who is known for his so-called strong rejectionism, which says that the statement is literally impossible. I propose a weak reading of the rejectionism thesis, which says that the statement is possible, but it is very improbable or not true. What we also need to look at is some forms of agnosticism about the question, such as the true agnosticism proposed by Hans Reichenbach, who said that the thesis cannot be proved nor disproved. Next we will look at the meaning skepticism by Carnap, who says that the statement is meaningless. And the last position that we're gonna look at today is the position of cognitive closure, which in this context was proposed by Colin McGill, and it states that this claim of everybody being kung fu fighting at the same time in history transcends human understanding. Let's start out with strong rejectionism, which says that kung fu thesis is literally impossible. Now, you see this emphasis on literally impossible. So there is a lot of stress on this word, and philosophically the understanding of the word impossibility does provide a lot of problems. And one solution, that we're just gonna make use of today, is the possible world semantics. This is a general approach to theories of meaning on which meanings, or more precisely semantic values, are assigned to sentences in terms of truth values they take across all possible worlds. So basically, if there is one logically possible world that contains this fact that everybody is kung fu fighting, then it is not logically impossible for everyone to be kung fu fighting. Now, one question is, how should we conceptualize those possible worlds in terms of logical laws or physical laws? Now, Ben Shapiro takes the logical impossibility. We can imagine a set of possible worlds, and they are restricted with what is logically not possible. So we could say that the worlds that don't exist are the ones where 1 + 1 is 3, circles are square, things simultaneously exist and don't, and everybody is kung fu fighting. If it is true that it is logically impossible for everybody to be kung fu fighting at the same time, then it should follow that in such a set of logical worlds there is not one where everybody would be kung fu fighting. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the American physicist, proposes the following thought experiment. We can in fact imagine an alien race that would be born and just start kung fu fighting from birth to death, and it would literally kung fu fight all the time. And at one point in time, it could be the case that only such aliens would exist in the universe. Therefore, it is not logically excluded for everyone to be kung fu fighting at the same time, because if that alien race would be the only existing species in the universe, and those aliens would be kung fu fighting all the time, then everybody could in fact be kung fu fighting. Neil deGrasse Tyson takes another route, namely the one of physical impossibility. Because he's a physicist, he talks about entropy, which has to do with the second law of thermodynamics, which basically states that the total entropy of any system does not decrease other than by increasing the entropy of some other system, which basically means that kung fu fighting releases a lot of energy, right? And he asked the question of how long could everybody be kung fu fighting before the eventual heat death of the universe. If everybody would kung fu fight all the time, this would release a lot of energy, and as a consequence, this would highly increase the entropy in the universe. Therefore, the heat death of the universe would come prematurely, but this is not happening right now, so we have reason to suppose that everybody was not kung fu fighting. Well, I personally found a fallacy in this line of thinking, which I named the Constancy myth. I basically claim that the Kung Fu thesis does not consist of the claim that everybody was Kung Fu fighting all the time, which yes could, as a consequence have a premature death of the universe. But no, actually, for the thesis to be true is that there would only have to be 1 second of everybody Kung Fu fighting at the same time, and it would make the claim true. So it is wrong to suppose that if the thesis would be true, too much energy would be released and the universe would, be destroyed. That's why I propose an alternative position called weak rejectionism, which states that the Kung Fu thesis is not impossible. So it is possible, but it is not true nonetheless. And one argument that I find quite convincing is the argument from babies. It starts with the premise that there's always babies on the world. Historical data does not provide any such evidence of there being a era in the history of the human race when there would be 0 babies on the world for at least a year or 2. So the premise 1 does seem to be quite strong and plausible. And the next premise is also supported by vast empirical data that babies can't kung fu fight. Now, if both premises are true, so there's always babies on the world and babies can't kung fu fight and everybody contains babies, there's always at least babies who are not kung fu fighting. Therefore, it cannot be the case that everybody was kung fu fighting at some time, because there was always people who were inherently unable to kung fu fight. Another position that I'd like to suggest is the Bayesian interpretation of the weak rejectionism, which states that the Kung Fu thesis seems at least very, very improbable. We can trace the development of Kung Fu fighting back to 221 BC. That's the most charitable interpretation we can give this argument, because at that time there seemed to be approximately 150 million people on the world. Now, as we go further down the history, there's gonna be more and more people, and therefore it's gonna get less and less likely that everybody was kung fu fighting at the same time, just like Mr. Shapiro said that it is literally impossible, although we disagree with that, to 7 billion people to be kung fu fighting at the same time. It might seem more probable that everybody was kung fu fighting at the same time in some historical era when there was less people around. But the most optimistic, guess, that would be around 200 BC, when there were approximately 150 million people around. So if one person is 7% likely to do kung fu fighting, the likelihood of 150 million people doing kung fu fighting at the same time amounts to approximately 0, is what Google says to this. Anyways, let's look at some forms of agnosticism, and we're gonna start with the true agnosticism proposed by Hans Reichenbach, who said that the Kung Fu thesis can't be proven nor disproven. Basically, the idea is that we cannot observe historical facts. They are in the past and we live in the present, therefore we cannot empirically verify what happened in the past or not. And this line of argument is also what led to the formulation of last Thursdayism. Basically, the idea that the universe could be created last Thursday, together with all of the supposedly historical facts and all of our memories, all of which would be created now, but we would still mistakenly believe that everything is much older than last Thursday. And this would also lead to the conclusion that everybody could not, in fact, be kung fu fighting, except they did it since last Thursday. And since we know that since last Thursday everybody was not kung fu fighting, and before last Thursday the universe did not exist, it could be the case that no one was kung fu fighting. The problem here is not metaphysical but empirical. Namely, it is impossible to prove the fact that everybody was kung fu fighting 2,000 years ago, because historical facts cannot be observed, only the consequences of those. But this claim seems to be a kind of problematic one, because the same kind of reasoning could be applied to any historical fact. And it really confuses two types of questions. For example, did the past really happen is a metaphysical question, but did Caesar exist is a factual question. And we cannot answer the Kung Fu thesis, the question that it poses, with a metaphysical answer and skepticism, because it's just not the same category of questions. So that line of thinking doesn't really get us anywhere. Another interesting objection to the claim was the vagueness present in it. Rudolf Carnap, a logical positivist, asks who is everyone, and does it really mean to kung fu fight? The idea here is that there's really two interpretations. One is that the language is vague, therefore we can't really do a lot with it, therefore you can't really position yourself towards some vague claims about reality, because they are not you don't really know what they amount to. Another possibility for how we can understand this skepticism is that Carnap says that the Kung Fu thesis is literally meaningless. And the idea here is that if we say that everything is X, then X seems to be irrelevant. What this means is beautifully expressed by Mr. Carnap. He says that if everybody did indeed Kung Fu fight, did anybody Kung Fu fight at all? The idea here is one that we can trace back to the French linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who says, for example, that in order for words to have meanings, we have to know what they don't mean. For example, I do not know what apple means if I just go around and call an orange an apple. I can only know what apple only means in virtue by not only calling an apple, but also knowing which things not to call an apple. I only know that an apple is an apple once I learn that the orange is not one, right? Words contrast each other. And in line of this, we can, imagine a alien visiting our world and, asking someone like, oh, what does it mean to Kung Fu fight? Well, how would we answer that question? We would simply go somewhere where people are Kung Fu fighting and show, like, point to those people and be like, yes, this is Kung Fu fighting. But the problem arises like if everybody would be Kung Fu fighting, like literally all the people on the world, and an alien would ask what it means to Kung Fu fight. We could not explain to the alien what it means to Kung Fu fight, because we couldn't point to anyone that is not Kung Fu fighting. Everybody would be Kung Fu fighting, so the alien wouldn't really know what we are pointing at when we're pointing to someone who is Kung Fu fighting. Are we pointing to the fact of him breathing, or Kung Fu fighting, or having hair, or having two legs? There has to be some differentiation, and if everybody is Kung Fu fighting, then it seems like it makes no sense to talk about Kung Fu fighting at all. Now, admittedly, this position is quite weird. I don't necessarily agree with the view of Carnap, but I'm more inclined to believe Colin McGill when he talks of cognitive closure, which is a concept about the human minds being constitutionally incapable of understanding a philosophical problem, for example. We can, in analogy, we can think of a dog and its efforts to understand special relativity. Of course, that would probably be quite hard for the dog, and by analogy, there have to be some problems or conceptual ideas and problems in nature that are constitutionally, they transcend human understanding. They are either too complex or, too different in nature of our workings, of our brains. And by this line of thinking, the same goes for the fact that everybody was Kung Fu fighting. McGill argues that this is a question that human minds are constitutionally incapable of understanding. Yes, that's the word. Now, I don't want to make it seem like everybody rejected the claim that everybody was Kung Fu fighting. In fact, there were some philosophers that tried to reformulate the thesis so that we would get a new understanding, a better, more precise one of what it means for everybody to Kung Fu fight. And most notably, Sir Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead gave a new formulation of the claim. Now, traditionally, what we see written here is that the Kung Fu thesis amounts to the fact that there exists a particular time 1, where it was the case that for every individuum, it applied that they were Kung Fu fighting. And we have to omit the set of all individuals to the set of all people. Now, Russell and Whitehead were not happy with such a formulation and proposed that we should rather understand the thesis in the following way. If time as a concept exists, that implies that time as a totality of things does exist, and that implies that it exists at time 1, a particular time, and it must be the case then that there exists a time 1, and that implies that the set of possible worlds should be understood as an existence of time where all the individuals would have the probability of Kung Fu fighting as long as they have an element of possible worlds, and the concept of possible world implies the existence of one particular world where it is the case that individuals exist, and both that individuals exist must imply the fact that time exists. I mean, say what you want, it's a bit harder to argue with that statement. But anyways, that's it for today. I just wanted to, hopefully now you have some basic understanding of the claim and the philosophy surrounding it. And maybe in the comments you can let me know about how you look at the claim, how you understood it, and whether, well, you believe it to be true. What do you think? Is there a point in space and time where everybody was kung fu fighting, or is that possible? Is that probable? Is it even possible for the human mind to understand what it means? I'm happy to have a conversation about that in the comments.